Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're the podcast where we take the sources you share and, well, we dive deep to unpack what really matters.
Exactly. We try to get beyond the surface level and understand the core information, the insights hidden in the details.
And today, we're tackling a really important, though quite challenging topic, the situation inside Eritrea. You've sent us several sources to look at.
That's right. We have an article here from journalist Martin Plaut. There's a detailed report from Article 19, the human rights organization called Eritrea, a nation silenced, and even a discussion thread from Reddit.
So, quite a mix. And our goal here is to synthesize these, to pull out the key threads, especially concerning the fate of political prisoners like Petros Solomon and, the overall climate for information and dissent in the country.
Looking at both the individual stories, where possible, and the broader systemic context these sources describe.
Okay, let's jump right in. What are these sources telling us? Maybe we should start with the Martin Plaut article. It seems to have some very specific and honestly quite disturbing recent information about prominent political prisoners, the G15 group specifically. What's the headline there?
Well, the article reports, based on its sources, that as of October 2023, 11 of the original 15 members of that group are believed to be no longer alive.
11 out of 15. That's a huge number, especially considering how long they've been held. The article names Petros Solomon and Mustafa Hussein specifically as being among those who've passed away.
Yes, it does. And it's careful to note that this information comes from cited sources, acknowledging the difficulty in, getting direct confirmation from inside Eritrea.
Right. And does it give any details about their health before these reported deaths?
It does provide some worrying details. For Petros Solomon, it mentions hypertension and recent angina pectoris, needing frequent trips to a hospital. Mustafa Hussein, it says, suffered from severe diabetes.
And there was that detail about the timing, too.
Yeah, the source cited in the article claims Petros passed away on the 22nd of a month and Mustafa just 16 hours later. It paints a grim picture.
It really does. And then there's this other element, mentioned the burials. What does the article say about that?
It touches on this belief, apparently circulating, that prominent political figures like them aren't given traditional burials. Instead, the speculation is burial at sea, perhaps in the Red Sea or in a lake.
Buried at sea.
The article mentions others, too, like Haylod Detense, Agbe Abraha, Mahmoud Sharifo, and also Burhan Abreha, all believed by some sources to have possibly met this fate.
And the suggested reason for this?
The article frames it as a practice used with dissidents, basically to eliminate any trace, any grave site, any focal point for memory or opposition.
That's incredibly bleak. So the article suggests these deaths aren't just tragic events, but linked directly to the conditions of their decades-long detention.
Absolutely. It points to the sheer length of detention, the harsh conditions, and the lack of mobility as key factors. Not necessarily an acute event, but the cumulative impact.
Which, for people with underlying health conditions like hypertension or diabetes, that's critical. What about medical care? Did they get any proper treatment?
Well, the source indicates that's a major issue. It suggests that the prisoners didn't have access to properly trained doctors. Instead, only untrained medical staff were reportedly available.
Untrained staff. And there were specific examples given, weren't there?
Yes, very concerning ones. Mustafa Hussein, for example, reportedly received incorrect medication, which the source claims caused him to go blind. And his diet was allegedly so poor he became severely emaciated.
Terrible. And Burhan Abreha's case.
Also detailed, he apparently had serious health issues before his arrest: liver, kidney, heart problems, even a liver transplant that the government itself had previously paid for. But despite getting some medication in prison, his health just plummeted over 13 months, reportedly due to the detention conditions and a relapse of liver cirrhosis.
It really highlights how the environment itself could be fatal, regardless of any specific action. Okay, so that covers their fate and conditions. But why were they the G15, including Petros Solomon, imprisoned in the first place over 2 decades ago? Let's bring in the Article 19 report and the Reddit discussion here.
Right. Article 19 gives us the wider backdrop. Eritrea has been under a transitional government since independence in '93. And this government, the report argues, frequently uses things like a continuous state of emergency and invoking national security to silence any opposition or dissent.
And 2001 seems to be a really key moment in that story.
Definitely. A major crackdown. The government shut down the entire private press overnight, claiming it endangered national security. And as part of that sweep, Article 19 states at least 18 journalists and 11 former government officials were arrested. That group of officials is the G15, or at least the 11 arrested then. And Petros Solomon, former foreign minister, was one of them.
So that's the context from Article 19. But then looking at the government's justification and the discussions, like on Reddit, things get, well, complicated. What were the official reasons given for arresting these high-profile former officials?
The official charges, cited by Article 19 from an African Commission document, were sweeping. Things like conspiring to overthrow the legal government, colluding with hostile foreign powers, compromising sovereignty, undermining national security, and endangering Eritrean society. Very serious accusations.
Extremely serious. But the Reddit thread suggests there's a lot of questioning and alternative theories about those official reasons, right?
Absolutely. This is where the lack of transparency becomes really apparent. You see different narratives. For instance, some sources mentioned in the thread, like Ambassador Deborhan or the brother of one of the G15 members, apparently claim the G15 did have links to the Woyen, the TPLF, during fighting, essentially framing it as treason.
Okay, so that aligns somewhat with the government's line, at least the colluding with foreign powers part. But what about the pushback in that thread?
Well, many users there are skeptical. They point out the complete lack of public evidence. If there was real proof of treason, phone taps, emails, documents, wouldn't the government have presented it to justify holding these prominent figures for decades without trial? The silence on evidence is seen as telling.
That makes sense. And are there other explanations floating around in that discussion besides treason?
Yes. One strong counter-narrative is that the G15 weren't traitors collaborating externally, but were actually challenging the government internally. That they were imprisoned for calling for democratic reforms, for accountability, basically for breaking ranks during a critical wartime period.
So internal dissent being labeled as treason, there's also the idea of them being scapegoats.
Exactly. That perspective suggests the arrests were convenient. A way to shift blame for maybe military setbacks or internal problems, deflect public anger, and paint any internal criticism as dangerous betrayal.
And there was one more, sort of, darker theory mentioned in the thread, wasn't there? About their past involvement.
Yeah, it's a complex take. One user suggests the G15 members, having been part of the ruling PFDJ system themselves, might have been aware of or even complicit in earlier government actions, maybe things like disappearances before 1998.
So the idea is...
The idea floated is that President Isaias Afwerki, often called issue in these discussions, might have used this alleged prior complicity, combined with the new treason accusations, as leverage. Basically, a way to silence them effectively without needing a messy public trial, because maybe there were other things they wouldn't want revealed. It's speculation, of course, but it highlights the layers of mistrust.
What really strikes me here is how the lack of any transparent process, any evidence presented, any trial for the G15 just fuels all these competing narratives. Even among critics, there isn't one clear story, which seems to be a direct result of the information vacuum.
Precisely. And the impact of this repression, this lack of due process, it doesn't just stop with the G15 members themselves.
Right, the Reddit thread brings this up, the question of family members being imprisoned too, people seemingly not involved in the political dispute directly.
The case of Astrid Johannes, Petros Solomon's wife, is often brought up as a prime example. A Reddit user mentions her story studying overseas, apparently getting assurances from an ambassador that it was safe to come back, and then being arrested on arrival, despite, reportedly, having no political role herself after independence.
It demonstrates how wide the net is cast. It's not just the alleged actors, but their families too.
And Article 19 echoes this broader pattern. Remember the journalists arrested back in 2001 alongside the G15? The report notes that, as of when they published, at least 8 of those journalists had also died in detention. It shows a consistent tragic pattern affecting different groups perceived as problematic by the state.
So individuals like Petros Solomon weren't isolated cases, but part of a much larger system of silencing dissent, often with fatal outcomes. And the Article 19 report really digs into how that system is maintained, right? They talk about the control of information this nation silenced.
They do. It's a core part of their analysis. They state flatly, there is no private media in Eritrea. No private newspapers, TV, radio, it's all state-controlled.
And they identify specific laws that enable this, like the Press Proclamation from 1996. What's the issue with that law?
Article 19 calls it fundamentally flawed. It essentially codifies a state monopoly on broadcasting. It requires government licenses for any press activity, licenses the government can just deny, and it completely bans foreign ownership or funding of media outlets.
So it controls who can speak, but does it also control what can be said?
Yes, very much so. The proclamation sets out really broad content restrictions, things like prohibiting information that vilifies or belittles beliefs, or inaccurate information meant to cause confusion or disturb peace, or anything seen as inciting division or vilifying the Eritrean people's tradition of struggle.
That sounds incredibly broad. Basically, anything the government doesn't like could potentially fall into those categories.
Exactly. And these aren't just guidelines. They can be enforced with criminal penalties. The report also points out how vague national security laws in the Penal Code are often used against journalists just for reporting on matters of public interest, something international standards protect.
So Article 19 sees these laws, plus the ongoing state of emergency, as tools the government actively uses to quash any criticism and protect itself.
That's their argument, yes. And it's compounded by the lack of infrastructure. Very low telephone and internet access compared to other places. Plans for mobile internet were apparently even shelved, possibly due to fears inspired by the Arab Spring. It limits alternative channels for information.
It creates a kind of information fortress. Even international agreements seem to be kept at arm's length.
Right. The report notes that even human rights treaties Eritrea has signed aren't clearly integrated into domestic law or made easily available, making it hard for citizens or even judges to refer to them.
Okay, so we have this stark picture. Individuals like Petros dying after decades in detention without trial, families impacted, widespread information control underpinned by law and lack of access. What about the international community? Are they just watching this happen? What do the sources say about calls for change?
No, there's significant international concern documented, particularly in the Article 19 report. Bodies like the African Union and the UN have made recommendations,
Like what specifically?
urging Eritrea to cooperate with the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the country, supporting the renewal of that mandate, suggesting Eritrea join things like the African Peer Review Mechanism for Accountability.
And pushing for actual legal reforms.
Yes, definitely. Calls to clarify the status of the Constitution, to properly incorporate international human rights law into domestic law, and critically, to guarantee access to information for all people, not just citizens.
And that problematic press proclamation.
A major focus. The recommendation is basically repeal or radically overhaul it. Things like ending the state monopoly, maybe having licensing done independently if it exists at all, removing criminal penalties for speech, lifting bans on foreign media and funding.
They also want changes to other laws like defamation and national security.
Right. Abolish criminal defamation. Rewrite national security laws so they're very specific, requiring proof of intent to incite imminent violence, likelihood of violence, and a direct link, not just broad suppression tools.
There's even a suggestion to add laws protecting journalists.
Yeah, adding crimes against freedom of expression to the criminal code to try and tackle the impunity when journalists or activists are attacked.
And did any regional bodies rule specifically on the G11 and journalists case?
Yes, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, ACHPR, looked into it. They found Eritrea had violated the rights of the G11 officials and the journalists, specifically freedom of expression, liberty, and the right to a fair trial, because they were held incommunicado without charge or trial for so long.
And what did the ACHPR ask Eritrea to do?
They urged Eritrea to either release the detainees or give them prompt and fair trials, allow access for families and lawyers, and provide compensation.
But despite all these recommendations, these findings, has anything actually changed on the ground, according to the sources?
Sadly, the sources suggest not really. These recommendations haven't been adopted. The government's public stance, like President Ifwerki denying years ago that there even were imprisoned journalists, seems unchanged. The situation largely persists.
So let's try to pull all this together. We've looked at the fate of individuals like Petros, the G15, the terrible conditions, the fog of competing explanations for their arrests, the whole system of information control described by Article 19, and these international calls for change that seem to go unheeded. What's the main thread running through all this?
I think it's a clear, though deeply concerning picture of a state where political dissent, or even just independent information, is systematically suppressed, often with devastating human consequences. The story of Petros and the others isn't just about individuals, it's symptomatic of a broader system.
And the legal framework, the media control, It's not accidental.
Hmm.
It seems designed to maintain that suppression, using national security as a kind of catch-all justification.
Exactly. And that very control, that lack of transparency, makes understanding events incredibly difficult. The confusion and conflicting narratives around the G15 arrests, even among those outside the government, as seen on Reddit, really highlights that. When information is so tightly managed, truth becomes incredibly elusive.
We've seen how these different sources, journalism, human rights reporting, even online discussion, can each offer a piece of the puzzle, helping us understand a complex and often opaque situation. We've learned about the tragic fates, the lack of transparency, and the systemic silencing in Eritrea. International pressure continues, but the situation remains challenging. So reflecting on all this, particularly the difficulty in getting reliable information out of Eritrea, what does it make you think about the real power and maybe the danger inherent in controlling the flow of information itself?